The airport terminal buzzed with the usual symphony of bustling travelers, rolling suitcases, and muffled announcements over the loudspeaker. Among the crowd stood Mr. Wallace, a sharply dressed, middle-aged man whose every movement suggested impatience and entitlement. Clutching his first-class boarding pass in one hand and his designer briefcase in the other, he scanned the gate area with narrowed eyes, occasionally tapping his polished shoe against the tiled floor. The sharp clicks echoed his simmering agitation. Across the waiting area, families shared laughs, solo travelers scrolled on their phones, and flight attendants calmly readied themselves to the long journey ahead. Everything seemed ordinary, but it wouldn't be for long. A brief announcement from the airline's staff snapped everyone's attention. It was time to board. Passengers eagerly began to line up, but Mr. Wallace stood motionless, his expression shifting from discontent to something closer to unease. "Excuse me," he barked at a nearby gate agent, his tone curt. "Can I speak to the captain before this flight takes off?" The gate agent, a young woman named Melissa, who had learned to handle all kinds of unusual requests, tilted her head politely. "Is there something I can help you with, sir? Our captains are busy preparing for takeoff, but I'll be happy to pass on a message." No, he said, waving a dismissive hand. "I need to see the captain in person. It's an urgent matter." Melissa hesitated. Passengers asking to see the cockpit crew wasn't exactly standard protocol, but Mr. Wallace had an air of authority about him. A man used to getting what he wanted, she figured. After a quick consultation with her colleague, she agreed to relay the request, quietly wondering what this was all about. Moments later, the captain stepped out into the boarding area. Captain Ahmed stood tall and calm, his crisp uniform exuding professionalism. With a warm smile, he extended his hand toward Mr. Wallace. "Hello, sir. I understand you requested to speak with me. What seems to be the issue?" Wallace's eyes flicked over the captain, lingering for a moment too long. His handshake was reluctant. "Are you the pilot for this flight?" he asked, his tone colder than the words required. "Yes, sir," Captain Ahmed replied, his voice steady. "Is there something specific you'd like to discuss about the journey?" Wallace paused before dropping the question that made a couple of heads nearby turn. "Do you think it's appropriate to have someone like you flying this plane?" The insinuation in his words wasn't subtle. Captain Ahmed's expression didn't flinch, but Melissa, who was close enough to hear, felt her breath catch. A murmur spread among the other passengers waiting nearby as Wallace continued, clearly emboldened by his growing audience. "Look, I'm just saying, this isn't some personal attack or anything, but shouldn't certain positions, like piloting, require, let's say, certain standards?" His voice grew louder. "No offense, but is there someone else available? Someone more suitable?" The tension in the room was palpable now. Travelers glanced at one another, unsure if they should intervene or remain silent. Melissa looked to the captain, hoping he wouldn't lose his composure under the weight of such an offensive comment. But Captain Ahmed, calm as ever, merely nodded and gestured toward the gate. "One moment, sir," he said. "Let me check with my team to address your concern." He disappeared behind the boarding door, leaving Wallace standing tall, looking triumphant, as if he had accomplished something worthwhile. But his moment of self-satisfaction was short-lived, because what happened next would turn the room's dynamic, and Wallace's confidence, completely on its head. The room was thick with an uneasy silence after Captain Ahmed stepped away. Mr. Wallace, seemingly unaware of the ripple of judgment building among the passengers, crossed his arms and glanced around, as though seeking validation. But instead of support, he found passengers shifting uncomfortably or deliberately averting their eyes. A mother pulling her young daughter close threw him a disapproving look, while a group of young professionals in business attire whispered among themselves. The energy in the gate area had shifted, yet Wallace remained oblivious, his focus entirely on the situation he'd just sparked. Melissa, meanwhile, had returned to her desk, her fingers gripping the edge of her keyboard tighter than usual. She wasn't new to difficult passengers. There had been late complaints about seating, arguments over baggage fees, and the occasional outburst from someone trying to gain the boarding process. But this felt different. This wasn't about policies or preferences, it was personal. And though Melissa was torn between outrage and professionalism, she knew she couldn't intervene unless instructed. Still, she glanced at the closed door where Captain Ahmed had gone. What's he going to do? She thought, a mixture of admiration and concern filling her. Despite Wallace's condescending remarks, Ahmed had handled it all with a calmness that most people could only aspire to. But she also knew situations like this weren't simple. People like Wallace didn't just back down easily. In the background, the usual airport routine tried to reassert itself. Announcements for other flights blared over the intercom. More passengers began lining up at adjacent gates. But in this corner of the terminal, tension lingered in the air like an uninvited guest that no one could ask to leave. Wallace's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his concentration. He pulled it out with a flick of impatience and answered curtly. "Yes, I'll be at the meeting on time," he snapped, his voice clipped. "This is just a delay. I'm handling it." His tone carried an air of someone too accustomed to micromanaging, as though the world bent to his will alone. Hanging up, he began pacing near the window, glancing every so often at the passengers who were now avoiding his eyes. His movements were quick, almost twitchy, as though he couldn't quite shake a nagging thought. Perhaps somewhere beneath the layers of arrogance, he was questioning whether he'd overstepped. But if so, he gave no outward sign. Behind the scenes, Captain Ahmed was in the crew lounge with 2 flight attendants and a senior supervisor. The conversation was brief but purposeful. Ahmed explained the situation calmly, choosing his words with care, while the others listened, expressions ranging from disbelief to measured anger. "It's not the first time this has happened," Ahmed said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of wariness. "But we have policies for a reason." The supervisor, a no-nonsense woman named Clara, nodded thoughtfully. "Do you want to escalate this to security?" she asked, folding her arms. "If he's refusing to board because of something like this, it's technically a disruption." Ahmed shook his head. "No, let's handle it with diplomacy. If it escalates further, then we can involve them. For now, let's see if he's willing to face the consequences of his own assumptions." Back at the gate, the murmurs among passengers had turned into quiet discussions. Several people openly exchanged disapproving comments about Wallace, though no one approached him directly. Meanwhile, Melissa was working to keep her composure, occasionally glancing nervously at the crowd, wondering if they would soon have to make an announcement about a potential delay. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the boarding door opened and Captain Ahmed returned, flanked by Clara. Together, they walked toward Mr. Wallace, who stopped his pacing and straightened his tie, wearing a thin smile that bordered on smug. Clearly, he was expecting some sort of capitulation to his demands, a reassigned pilot, perhaps, or a private reassurance that his concerns had been taken into account. "Mr. Wallace," Ahmed began, his voice polite, but with a firmness that suggested he would not be cowed. "Thank you for your patience. We've reviewed your concerns and discussed the matter with our team." Good, Wallace interrupted, his voice softening into a more self-satisfied tone. "I trust you've realized how important it is to maintain the highest standards for situations like this." Ahmed raised an eyebrow, but continued without hesitation. "As part of our airline's core values, we prioritize professionalism, safety, and respect. Our hiring process reflects those values. The pilots for this flight, including myself, meet and exceed every standard for skill, training, and experience required by international aviation authorities. There are no grounds for your request." Wallace blinked, clearly not expecting such a clear dismissal. "But listen, I wasn't trying to." Ahmed held up a hand, stopping him gently but firmly. "Furthermore, sir, this incident has raised concerns about how we maintain a comfortable and respectful environment for all our passengers and crew." It's my responsibility to inform you that while you are welcome to fly with us, you must abide by our code of conduct. Discriminatory behavior, implied or explicit, is not tolerated. Clara stepped forward now, her voice steady but firm. If you are unable to comply with our policies, we will have to discuss whether continuing with this journey is the right choice for you. Wallace's jaw tightened, and he looked around as though seeking an ally. His gaze flickered to Melissa, but her eyes were locked firmly on her computer screen, unwilling to give him the support he craved. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but quickly snapped it shut when he caught the stony expressions of Clara and Ahmed. "I'm simply concerned about the flight's safety," he finally muttered, the earlier boldness draining from his tone. "Your concerns have been addressed, Mr. Wallace," said, his gaze steady. "It's now up to you to decide whether you'd like to board or make other travel arrangements." The other passengers were watching now, their earlier silence giving way to subtle glances of approval and even small nods directed at Ahmed and Clara. Wallace, realizing he'd lost the crowd, gave a sharp exhale. "Fine," he said, his voice tight with barely concealed frustration. "I'll board, but this isn't over." "Oh, I think it is," Clara replied quietly, her tone laced with authority. Wallace stood there a moment longer, then walked toward the gate, muttering under his breath. As he handed Melissa his boarding pass, he avoided eye contact, clearly humiliated. She scanned it with steady hands, watching as he disappeared down the jetway, his posture stiffer than before. As the boarding process resumed, whispers buzzed like static among the passengers. A young man leaned over to his companion, whispering, "Did you hear what that guy said? Unbelievable." "I can't believe the captain stayed that calm," his friend replied. Behind the scenes, Ahmed and Clara exchanged a quiet nod before he too headed toward the plane, ready to take his place in the cockpit. Despite the tension, his focus never wavered. There was a job to do, and as always, he was committed to doing it with integrity and professionalism. The tension may have subsided for the moment, but the flight was just beginning, and the story was far from over. Once inside the plane, Mr. Wallace made his way to his first-class seat, gripping his briefcase tighter than before. The tight-lipped anger in his face had given way to a mix of irritation and unease. His seat, a spacious leather recliner near the front, didn't seem to comfort him as he settled in with a huff. Around him, other passengers were stowing their luggage or quietly discussing what had just transpired at the gate, their whispers barely audible over the cabin's ambient noise. The hum of preparation continued. Flight attendants walked the aisles, offering warm smiles, greeting passengers, and demonstrating an unwavering professionalism that masked any lingering tension. But among themselves, the crew couldn't shake the uncomfortable moment that had unfolded just moments ago. Sarah, a senior flight attendant with years of experience, shared a brief glance with Daniel, her younger colleague, as they secured the cabin for takeoff. "Do you think he's going to make trouble during the flight?" Daniel whispered, his tone low but concerned. "He's angry," Sarah replied quietly, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear as she adjusted a passenger's overhead luggage. "But I doubt he'll do anything more. He's probably embarrassed. Men like him tend to crawl back into their shells after someone stands up to them." Daniel nodded, though he couldn't quite shake the uneasy feeling that simmered just beneath his professional exterior. As Sarah moved down the aisle, she passed by Wallace's seat. He was staring straight ahead, his face stony, but when she paused to offer him a drink before takeoff, he waved her off with a brusque gesture. Sarah bit the inside of her cheek, maintaining her smile as she continued down the aisle. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Ahmed was focused on the pre-flight checks. The comforting familiarity of the controls and routine grounded him, as it always did. His co-pilot, an affable man in his early 40s named Greg, glanced sideways. "You okay?" Greg asked, his voice calm but lined with curiosity. Ahmed's hands moved efficiently across the dials as he nodded. "I'm fine," he replied evenly. Greg paused for a moment before adding, You handled that well out there. A lot better than I would have. That guy sounded like a handful. Ahmed allowed himself a brief smile. This isn't the first time I've dealt with a passenger like him, he admitted. It probably won't be the last. The key is not letting them dictate your energy. Greg chuckled softly. Still, I think he met his match. People like him are so used to having the last word. Ahmed simply nodded, his focus shifting back to their departure checklist. The conversation faded into the quiet rhythm of preparation, but even as Ahmed remained composed, there was no ignoring the nagging thought that lingered at the back of his mind. He knew how fragile the calm of a flight could be, especially with someone like Mr. Wallace on board. As the plane taxied down the runway and lifted gracefully into the air, Wallace stared out of the window, his jaw tight. Below him, the airport shrank into a network of lights and tiny structures, and for the first time in hours, the outside world felt distant. But the feeling wasn't comforting. It felt confining. Being trapped in the air with a pilot he didn't trust only heightened the irrational indignation brewing inside him. He pulled out his phone, forgetting it should have been on airplane mode, and began typing furiously into a notes app, as though putting his thoughts into words would give them clarity. He didn't notice Sarah watching him from across the aisle, her brow furrowed. She took a deep breath and made her way over, bending slightly to speak softly. "Excuse me, sir. We've begun our ascent, so you'll need to put your phone into airplane mode. It's standard protocol for passenger safety." Wallace glared up at her, then at his phone, muttering, "Fine," under his breath before switching it off. Sarah remained polite as ever but walked away with a gnawing unease. Something about his attitude didn't sit right with her. Midway through the flight, the cabin lights dimmed as passengers settled in. Most were quietly watching movies, reading, or drifting off to sleep. But Wallace stayed wide awake, flipping through an Inflight magazine with visible frustration. When his glass of water arrived, he pushed it to the far edge of the tray table, as though even the simplest gestures of service were beneath him. Elsewhere in the cabin, a different story unfolded. A young boy in economy, no older than 10, was sitting near the window, beaming with excitement. His mother leaned in, whispering to him about the wonder of flight. Every so often, the boy glanced toward the cockpit door, as if imagining the heroes at work behind it. He had a toy plane in his hands and pretended it was soaring through the sky, making soft engine noises as he played. The mother caught the attention of Sarah, who was making her rounds with the snack cart. "Excuse me," the woman asked softly, gesturing toward her son. "Is there any chance the captain would be willing to sign something for him? He's been fascinated with planes for as long as I can remember. It would absolutely make his day." Sarah smiled, grateful for the warmth of this request after the earlier ordeal. "Let me check with the captain," she replied warmly. "I'm sure he'd be honored." Sarah disappeared behind the cockpit door, where she found Ahmed scanning his instruments with quiet focus. She hesitated before speaking, not wanting to disrupt his work. "Captain Ahmed," she said gently, "there's a boy in row 18 who's a huge fan of aviation. His mom wondered if you could sign something for him. He's got this little toy plane, and I think it'd really mean the world to him." Ahmed's face softened, a genuine smile tugging at his lips. "Of course," he said. "I'd be happy to." He grabbed a pen and a small card bearing the airline's logo and jotted down a message for the boy. Asterisk to a future pilot. Always dream big. Captain Ahmed asterisk. By the time Sarah delivered the note to the boy, his eyes lit up with joy. He showed it proudly to everyone around him, while his mother offered Sarah a heartfelt thank you. Nearby passengers smiled at the interaction, the quiet moment of connection a welcome contrast to the earlier tension at the gate. But in first class, Wallace noticed none of this. He was still stewing, his thoughts clouded with indignation. He leaned over the aisle and flagged down Daniel. "How long until we land?" he asked abruptly, ignoring the digital display on the seatback that showed the exact time. Daniel answered calmly, "Approximately 4.5 hours, sir." Wallace grunted and sat back in his seat, his body tense as he stared at the darkness beyond the window. What he didn't know, what he couldn't even begin to grasp, was that the seeds of his unraveling were already being sown, quietly, among the people around him. While Wallace brooded in isolation, Ahmed's kind gesture in economy had sparked quiet conversations among passengers, many of whom shared the story through texts or on social media. The airline's crew, attentive and professional as always, maintained the order of the flight, but behind every smile, there was the faint awareness that the man in 2A wasn't done. Not yet. The hours ticked by, but for Mr. Wallace, time seemed to move unbearably slow. He shifted in his seat, tugged at the cuffs of his pressed shirt, and alternated between glaring at the cabin crew and fidgeting with his phone, still in airplane mode. The frustration bubbling within him was palpable, spilling over into every movement he made. He tapped the tray table with his knuckles, a sharp rhythm that caught the attention of nearby passengers who exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. The cabin remained calm on the surface, with soft conversations murmuring in the background and the faint hum of the engines providing a steady soundtrack. Yet, under this calm facade was a mounting tension. Those who had witnessed Wallace's behavior at the gate or caught wind of the incident now kept subtle tabs on him, their attention piqued by the strange energy radiating from his corner of the plane. Sarah and Daniel continued their rounds, always professional but undeniably alert. Sarah, especially, had developed a sixth sense for when passengers might cause trouble, and everything about Wallace's demeanor set off her internal alarm. He was too agitated, too restless. Every interaction with the crew seemed to feed his irritation rather than soothe it. Somewhere over the Atlantic, as the plane cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet, Wallace's tension finally spilled over. He pressed the call button with deliberate force, the small light glowing above his seat. Daniel was the first to respond, gliding down the aisle with his best customer service smile. "Yes, sir. How can I assist you?" Wallace leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "I want to know who I can speak to about filing a formal complaint," he said, his words clipped. Daniel blinked but kept his tone measured. "I'd be happy to provide you with the information, sir. You can file a complaint through our website, or if you'd prefer, I can bring you a comment card to fill out." Wallace's face tightened. "No, this isn't some trivial feedback. I want to speak to someone who can actually address this. Is there a supervisor on board?" Daniel's smile faltered for just a moment before he regained it. "Our lead flight attendant is available to speak with you, sir. Let me fetch her." A minute later, Clara appeared in the aisle, exuding calm authority as she approached Wallace. Her expression was kind but firm, the sort of demeanor that made it clear she wouldn't be easily rattled. "Good evening, Mr. Wallace. I understand you have a concern you'd like to discuss." Wallace gestured impatiently toward the cockpit. "It's not a concern, it's a liability issue. That pilot—" He paused, lowering his voice slightly but still speaking loudly enough that nearby passengers could hear. "That pilot isn't fit to fly this plane." Clara's expression didn't waver. "Captain Ahmed is one of our most experienced pilots, sir. I can assure you that your flight is in safe hands." Wallace's tone sharpened. "You can assure me all you want, but I'm not buying it. This is about more than qualifications. It's about trust. And frankly, I don't feel comfortable trusting my safety to someone like him." Clara drew a deep breath, her professionalism holding firm as the weight of the moment settled between them. "Mr. Wallace," she began, "we take the safety and comfort of all our passengers very seriously, and I can assure you that every member of our crew is highly qualified for their role. However, I need to be clear that discriminatory remarks or behavior are not acceptable on this flight or any of our flights." The low murmurs among nearby passengers grew louder now, their disdain for Wallace evident. One passenger, a middle-aged woman across the aisle, gave Clara a small nod of encouragement. "Thank you for saying that," the woman whispered, just loud enough for Wallace to hear. Wallace bristled, clearly taken aback by the growing disapproval. He straightened his posture, his voice rising just enough to carry. "I'm not being discriminatory. I'm being realistic. You're all so busy worrying about appearances that you're ignoring basic safety concerns. What if something happens? Do you really think?" "Enough." The sharp voice came from farther down the aisle. All heads turned to see the young man from business class, the one who had whispered earlier about Wallace's behavior. His tone was firm, but his face was calm, though it betrayed a deep sense of frustration. "You've made your point," the man said, rising from his seat. "We all heard you twice now. You don't think Captain Ahmed is qualified to fly this plane because of his ethnicity. We get it. But here's the thing, you're the only one on this flight who feels that way. The rest of us, we trust him. You're not the authority on what makes a good pilot, he is." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. Several passengers nodded or exchanged looks of solidarity. Wallace, caught off guard by the unexpected challenge, stammered for a moment before snapping, "This isn't about ethnicity, it's about standards." The young man cut him off again, his voice growing steadier with each word. "No, it is asterisk about ethnicity. It's about your inability to look beyond your own biases. You're acting like a captain's qualifications are up for debate just because you don't like how he looks. That's your problem, not his." The cabin fell silent for a moment, the weight of the young man's words sinking in. Wallace's face reddened as he fumbled for a reply, but nothing came. Even Clara, whose primary responsibility was de-escalation, allowed the silence to linger, recognizing the power of what had just been said. Finally, Wallace muttered, "This is ridiculous," before sinking back into his seat, his focus shifting to the window as though hoping to block out the world. Clara glanced at the young man and gave him a small nod of gratitude before addressing the cabin. "Thank you, everyone, for your patience and cooperation. We'll be continuing the flight without further interruptions. If anyone needs assistance, don't hesitate to call for a crew member." She turned back to Wallace, her voice low but firm. "Sir, I trust there won't be any further issues." Wallace grumbled something inaudible, waving her off with a dismissive gesture. Clara walked back to the galley, her heart pounding despite her calm exterior. She hated moments like these, when a passenger's behavior disrupted the harmony of a flight, but she also knew the importance of standing her ground, especially in defense of her crew. In the cockpit, Ahmed was unaware of the exact details unfolding in the cabin, though the occasional glance from the flight attendants told him enough. Still, his focus never wavered. The controls, the instruments, the countless details demanding his attention, they held him steady, even as the storm of judgment brewed just a few feet away. But this was far from over. High above the ocean, under the glow of the cabin lights, the tension lingered like an unspoken question. How would this all end? The cabin descended into an uneasy quiet after Clara walked away, but the air felt thicker now. The confrontation had shifted something in the dynamic of the flight. Passengers who had initially stayed silent now openly exchanged glances, whispered conversations filtering through the aisles. While some simply wanted the journey to continue peacefully, others appeared emboldened by the young man's words, their sense of justice outweighing their discomfort with confrontation. Wallace, however, was slumped in his seat, clearly irritated but momentarily subdued. In the cockpit, Ahmed maintained his calm, his attention fixed on their planned trajectory. He hadn't heard every word of what transpired in the cabin, but enough had been relayed by Greg and the occasional messages from the flight attendants to give him a picture of the situation. Greg's friendly chatter had slowed, a subtle attempt to lighten the mood, but Ahmed only responded with small nods or polite, single-word acknowledgements. He wasn't immune to the sting of prejudice, but he had learned long ago how to compartmentalize those moments, refusing to let them define him or shake his professionalism. As the plane continued on course, the calm was disrupted once again, not by Wallace, but by a sudden, unexpected flicker in the cabin lights. It lasted no more than a few seconds, but it was enough to draw attention. Some passengers turned their heads toward the ceiling, while others instinctively adjusted their seatbelts. Up front, Ahmed and Greg instantly picked up on the change. A slight disturbance in one of the electrical systems flashed across the control panels. Nothing urgent yet, but it demanded immediate attention. "Let's keep an eye on this," Ahmed said, his voice steady but focused. "Could just be a glitch, but I'll check the redundancy systems." In the cabin, Clara also noted the flickering lights, her professionalism kicking in before worry could take root. She made her way down the aisle, offering calm reassurances to passengers who had begun to ask questions. Wallace, however, seized the moment to reignite his complaints. He sat upright, his voice cutting through the quiet tension like a sharp blade. "What's going on now?" he demanded, gesturing dramatically toward the ceiling. "See, I said this would happen. There's clearly something wrong, and no one here is willing to admit it." Passengers groaned audibly, with a few rolling their eyes in open frustration. Clara stopped in her tracks, turning to Wallace with a patience that felt thinner now. "Sir, the situation is under control. There's no cause for alarm." Wallace leaned forward, his voice rising. "Under control." Then explained the lights flickering. "What's next? An engine failure? A mid-air collision? We wouldn't be in this mess if—" "Enough, sir," Clara interrupted, her tone firmer now. Her voice carried a quiet authority that stopped Wallace in his tracks. "Let me be perfectly clear. You are entitled to your opinion, but you are not entitled to disrupt this flight. If you continue, I will have no choice but to involve authorities when we land." For a moment, Wallace seemed stunned. It was clear he wasn't used to being spoken to this way, especially by someone in a position of perceived service. He opened his mouth, ready to snap back, but the collective weight of every gaze in the cabin bore down on him. Passengers were no longer quiet bystanders. They were openly annoyed, their loyalty aligned not with him, but with the crew that had handled this journey with grace and professionalism. Wallace leaned back, visibly fuming but silent for the moment. In the cockpit, Ahmed and Greg were running diagnostics when another minor issue popped up. A secondary navigation system flickered briefly before stabilizing. It wasn't critical, but combined with the earlier electrical anomaly, it warranted further attention. Ahmed's fingers moved deftly across the controls, activating backup systems and notifying air traffic control of the issue. "It's likely nothing," he said to Greg, his tone even, "but let's prepare for all scenarios." Greg nodded. "Do you want me to address the cabin or let Clara handle it?" Ahmed hesitated, his mind moving rapidly through the possibilities. Ultimately, he decided to focus on managing the flight itself, leaving the communication to his capable crew. "Let's give it a little more time. If the situation escalates, I'll make an announcement." Back in the cabin, the young boy in economy who had been thrilled to receive Ahmed's signature earlier was now pressing his face against the window, gazing at the dark expanse outside. His toy plane was still clutched tightly in his hands, but his playful engine noises had stopped. Instead, he turned to his mother, his tone curious but a little more serious. "Mom, is the plane okay?" he asked, his voice soft but concerned. His mother gave him a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, sweetheart. Planes are very safe. The pilots know exactly what to do." Her words carried more certainty than she felt, but she was determined not to let her son sense her worry. Meanwhile, passengers seated closer to the cockpit were becoming increasingly aware of the slight shifts in the plane's movements. It wasn't turbulence, not exactly, but there was a subtle tension in the way the plane adjusted itself, a feeling most wouldn't have noticed had it not been for the earlier flickering lights and Wallace's outburst. As Clara walked back to the galley, her professional demeanor began to crack ever so slightly. She leaned against the counter, taking a deep breath. Daniel approached, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "What do you think's going on?" he whispered, careful to keep his voice low enough that no nearby passengers could overhear. "I don't know," Clara admitted, glancing toward the cockpit door. But Ahmed's got it under control. He always does. Daniel nodded, though he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping into his chest. Behind them, the mood in the cabin grew more tense. Passengers who had been dozing off were now wide awake, some craning their necks to see what the flight attendants were doing, others tapping nervously on their armrests. The earlier camaraderie among the passengers had dissipated, replaced by an undercurrent of shared unease. Wallace, always one to exploit tension, smirked to himself. He could sense the shift and wasn't above taking advantage of it. For the first time since the plane had left the ground, he felt like the tide was turning in his favor. And then, just as the tension seemed ready to break, the plane jolted, not violently, but enough to send a ripple of alarm through the cabin. Drinks trembled in their holders, a few bags shifted in the overhead bins, and an audible gasp moved through the rows. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Ahmed's calm voice came over the intercom, his tone steady and professional. "We're experiencing a minor electrical issue, but I want to assure you that this aircraft is fully capable of completing the flight safely. As a precaution, we will be diverting to the nearest airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened, and we'll keep you updated as the situation progresses." The announcement was met with a mixture of relief and anxiety. Passengers exchanged worried glances but took solace in Ahmed's calm and measured delivery. Wallace, however, couldn't resist the opportunity. He leaned across the aisle, speaking loudly enough for others to hear. "Minor issue, huh? That's just what they say before something goes horribly wrong. I hope you all remember this when you're praising Captain Ahmed later." The cabin erupted into murmurs, the tension now at a breaking point. Clara hurried down the aisle, her expression firm, ready to put an end to Wallace's disruptions once and for all. But before she could reach him, the plane jolted again, this time harder. Overhead bins rattled, and a few passengers let out sharp cries of alarm. The cabin lights flickered once more, and the atmosphere shifted from uneasy to outright fearful. Whatever control Ahmed and his crew thought they had over the situation was slipping, and Wallace's smug satisfaction turned to wide-eyed panic as the true gravity of the moment settled in. The cabin erupted into chaos. Passengers clung to their armrests, their whispers and murmurs swelling into audible expressions of fear. The overhead compartments rattled ominously, and a few stray items tumbled into the aisle. Clara, her pulse racing, immediately shifted into emergency mode. She hurried to reassure the passengers, speaking in calm yet commanding tones, reminding everyone to keep their seatbelts fastened. Beside her, Daniel moved swiftly, assisting a mother with a crying baby who was trying to calm her little one's wails amid the growing uncertainty. Ahmed, in the cockpit, was completely focused. The plane's instrumentation was stable again, but the series of minor malfunctions was too irregular to ignore. He and Greg quickly consulted their flight manuals and determined the safest course of action. "We've got the nearest airport cleared for landing," said, his tone unshakable. "We'll descend gradually and keep the situation under control." His hands moved deftly across the controls, fine-tuning adjustments with a precision that came from years of experience. Greg glanced sideways at Ahmed. "Whatever's causing this," Greg said, "we're lucky to have you up here, man." Ahmed only nodded, his focus unwavering. He pressed the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've initiated our descent and will be landing shortly. Please remain seated, keep your seatbelts securely fastened, and listen closely to the flight attendants. Safety remains our highest priority." In the cabin, Clara and her crew distributed clear instructions. Passengers tightened their seatbelts and stowed loose belongings, their collective anxiety thick in the air. Even Wallace, for all his previous bluster, had grown uncharacteristically quiet, gripping the armrests as he stared out the window, the flicker of lights reflecting off his pale face. As the plane descended through thick clouds, turbulence made the ride bumpier than usual. Gasps rippled through the cabin each time the aircraft jolted. Clara remained calm, repeating instructions with steady determination. Sarah moved methodically down the aisle, giving passengers a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder as she passed. It was these human touches, these small gestures of care, that stopped the panic from overwhelming the cabin completely. Suddenly, just as the plane emerged below the clouds, a new alert flashed on the cockpit screens. The weather at the emergency airport had rapidly deteriorated. A surprise thunderstorm rolling through the area had worsened visibility, making an immediate landing there less than ideal. Ahmed made a swift decision to reroute to a secondary airport farther away, along the journey but with clear skies and calmer conditions. The detour, while logical, wasn't without risk. Fuel calculations showed they'd be cutting it closer than anyone would have liked. "Do you think we can make it?" Greg asked, his tone cautious. Ahmed met his co-pilot's eyes briefly. "We'll make it," he said firmly. "I've got this." As the cockpit finalized its plan, passengers were notified of the change. The announcement stirred up another wave of murmurs, with some passengers crying softly while others clung tightly to their loved ones. For the first time during the flight, Wallace didn't complain or draw attention to himself. His face was pale, and he stared ahead with a faraway look, lost in thoughts he wouldn't dare to share. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the plane finally leveled out, heading toward the second airport. Slowly, the atmosphere began to shift again, fear giving way to cautious hope. Clara checked her watch, realizing they were within 20 minutes of touchdown. And then something extraordinary happened. A soft cheer rose from the back of the plane, rippling forward like an unexpected wave. Passengers had spotted the lights of the airport emerging in the distance. The sight filled the cabin with collective relief, even as the bumpy turbulence persisted. Clara smiled for the first time in hours, though she knew not to relax until wheels touched the ground. In those final minutes, Ahmed spoke again to air traffic control, navigating the approach with calm precision. Greg monitored the gauges, keeping a close eye on fuel levels. The runway came into focus, stretching wide and welcoming like an oasis in a desert. The landing was smooth, a testament to Ahmed's skill, and as the plane rolled to a stop on the tarmac, the cabin erupted in applause and cheers. Passengers hugged each other, some wiping tears from their eyes. A wave of relief and gratitude swept through the plane, washing away the tension and fear that had dominated the flight. As the crew began post-landing protocols, Clara made her way to the cockpit. She knocked lightly before entering, offering a bright smile despite the stress that still lingered. "That was incredible," she said. "You handled it perfectly." Ahmed looked up from the controls, meeting her gaze with a quiet humility. "Just doing my job," he said, though the weight of the moment was evident in his tone. Back in the cabin, Wallace remained seated as the other passengers began disembarking. For the first time, he seemed subdued, as though the experience had drained all the fight from him. As Clara passed by, he finally spoke, his voice softer and more measured than it had been the entire journey. "Tell the captain," he paused, swallowing hard. "Tell him, thank you." Clara didn't respond immediately, her expression unreadable. But then she nodded, offering a small smile. "I'll let him know." As Wallace gathered his things, walking off the plane with the rest of the passengers, the young man from business class caught his eye. Their gazes locked briefly, but instead of anger, there was something like quiet acknowledgement between them, a recognition of lessons learned in unexpected ways. The final twist came later, in the terminal. As passengers mingled near baggage claim, waiting for their belongings, a flight announcement on the airport's overhead speakers made them pause. A separate crew stepping off another plane walked through the terminal, including an older, grizzled pilot who carried himself with authority. Wallace spotted him and froze, recognition dawning instantly. The pilot passed by with no fanfare, but Wallace remained rooted in place, piecing together the truth. The man was unmistakably Captain Ahmed's father, a retired pilot known for breaking barriers in aviation decades earlier. The irony hit Wallace like a thunderclap. He had spent the entire flight questioning Ahmed's right to lead, unaware that Ahmed's career was built on the legacy of a man whose footsteps were written in aviation history. As the crowd moved around him, Wallace remained standing in stunned silence, grappling with the realization that prejudice had blinded him in more ways than one. The airport buzzed with the hum of announcements, chatter, and the steady movement of weary passengers collecting their belongings. The tension of the flight had ebbed, replaced by the shared relief of being safely back on the ground. People drifted toward their gates or baggage claim, their faces lit with quiet gratitude, exhaustion, or reflection on the day's events. Clara stood near the gate with Daniel, watching the last few passengers filter out. She felt a surge of pride for her team, and especially for Ahmed. The situation had been tense, even frightening at moments, but their teamwork had turned what could have been a disaster into a safe arrival. "I think that might have been the longest flight of my life," Daniel muttered with a crooked smile, leaning back against a column. "It wasn't easy," Clara admitted, glancing at him. "But when you have a captain like Ahmed up front, it makes you believe everything's going to be okay." Daniel nodded, his usual lightheartedness replaced with quiet respect. "He's something else, isn't he?" Didn't even flinch through any of it. At that moment, Ahmed stepped off the plane. He walked toward his crew, a calm, reserved expression on his face. There were no grand displays, no chest-puffing sense of accomplishment, just his usual grounded humility. Clara smiled and approached him. "Captain," she said warmly, "there's something you should know. Wallace, our loudest critic of the day, asked me to thank you." I don't think he even believed those words came out of his mouth. Ahmed let out a soft chuckle. "Small victories," he said. "Maybe the experience taught him something." He paused, tilting his head thoughtfully. "Or maybe not. Either way, it's not about changing one man. It's about doing the job right for everyone on that flight." Daniel smirked. "Spoken like a true leader." Ahmed nodded but didn't bask in the compliment. Instead, he turned his attention to Clara. "You all did a phenomenal job back there. I heard some of what happened while you were dealing with him," he said, nodding toward the now distant figure of Wallace. "You handled it with a professionalism that can't be taught. That made all the difference for the rest of the passengers." Clara felt a rush of gratitude. She knew Ahmed wasn't one to hand out praise lightly, and his words meant more than she could express. "Thank you, Captain," she said simply. The crew dispersed to begin their post-flight routines, but Ahmed lingered for a moment, glancing across the bustling terminal. The sound of children laughing, families reuniting, and travelers dragging rolling suitcases filled the air. Despite his stoic demeanor, there was something in his eyes, a quiet sense of fulfillment that went beyond professional accomplishment. Just a short distance away, Wallace stood awkwardly by the baggage claim carousel, his usually confident stance subdued. He hadn't made eye contact with a single person since disembarking. His usual sarcastic commentary had vanished. Instead, his mind was replaying every moment of the flight, each decision made by Ahmed, and the way the crew had handled themselves under pressure. Seeing Ahmed's calm, unflinching leadership had unraveled something inside him. It was disorienting, but he couldn't deny that his assumptions, the ones he clung to so tightly, had been challenged. As Wallace watched the carousel churn out suitcase after suitcase, his gaze strayed to the retired pilot in the terminal, Ahmed's father. Wallace didn't know the full story, but something about that passing moment stuck with him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like talking or offering unsolicited opinions. He just felt quiet. Meanwhile, near the plane, the young boy who had received Ahmed's signature earlier was bubbling with energy again. His fears during the flight had evaporated, replaced with pure excitement over the safe landing. As he spotted Ahmed walking past the window, his face lit up. "Mom, there he is," the boy exclaimed, tugging on her sleeve. "The pilot. He's the best pilot ever, isn't he?" His mother smiled warmly, scooping the boy into her arms. "He is, sweetheart. You should remember this, okay? Bravery isn't about not being afraid. It's about staying calm and doing the right thing, no matter what. That's what your captain did today." The boy nodded eagerly, waving energetically toward Ahmed, who smiled and gave a small wave in return through the glass. By the time Ahmed made it through the terminal, the bustling energy had begun to settle. He found himself walking alongside Greg, the weight of the flight behind them, but still vivid in their minds. "You ever get tired of proving people wrong?" Greg asked casually, though the respect in his tone was evident. Ahmed smiled faintly, shaking his head. "It's not about proving anything to anyone else. As long as I know I'm doing what's right, that's enough for me. People can think what they want." Greg chuckled, running a hand through his hair. "I'll tell you this, you made a few fans back there today, and maybe even one unlikely one." Didn't respond, but he appreciated the thought. For him, it wasn't about gaining admiration or converting skeptics. It was about doing the job he loved, and doing it with integrity. As the day wore on and the flight's passengers went their separate ways, each carried something away with them. Some had found new respect for the crew who had handled a tense situation with professionalism and care. Others quietly reflected on the experience, reevaluating assumptions they might not have known they carried. Wallace left the terminal as quietly as he had stayed after landing. He didn't speak to anyone as he slipped into a waiting car, his usually sharp demeanor softened by a mixture of exhaustion and introspection. He would never admit it out loud, not yet anyway, but the flight had planted something new in his mind. A question maybe, or perhaps a recognition of his own limitations. Ahmed, now on the shuttle headed home, gazed out the window at the setting sun. The fiery colors streaking across the sky reminded him of why he had chosen this career, why he endured moments like today. The sky didn't care about who you were, where you came from, or what others thought of you. It was just there, vast and open, offering the promise of new horizons. As the shuttle rolled on, Ahmed closed his eyes briefly, feeling the exhaustion of the day finally settle over him. His last thought before drifting into a light doze was simple but powerful. No matter what turbulence came his way, he would always stay the course.